Gateway drug. Danny Thornton hated everybody in his high school. "One more year until I can drop out," he reminded himself before pushing the gymnasium doors open, just wide enough to peek through. The lights were off. The room was empty, aside from the basketball hoops towering above him at each end. Sunlight poured through the high-set windows, shedding its beams across the tiled floor. Danny slipped through the doors and pulled them shut. There was no PE during 6th hour on Friday, and Danny knew it. He also knew there was an exit door behind the coach's office. It was an emergency exit off the short hallway leading to the sports equipment closet. The door had an automatic lock, making it impossible to get in from the outside. But from the inside, it opened with ease. Danny crept through the shadows between the patches of sunlight, the roots of his unkempt hair damp with sweat. His heartbeat thudded in his ears as he glanced back at the gymnasium doors to make sure he was still alone. He was. He wiped the sheen of perspiration from his forehead and told himself he wasn't scared of getting caught. Scared wasn't the right word. He was on edge because getting caught would ruin his afternoon. He passed center court, his footsteps quiet and quick. He couldn't wait to leave, to be free of this place. 6th hour was the absolute worst. It was Mrs. Pritchett's class, and if the subject matter algebra wasn't bad enough, the teacher was a real bitch, too. Yesterday, she'd forced Danny to take a pop quiz out loud while the entire class listened. It was punishment for nodding off during her lesson. Everyone laughed at Danny when he got several answers wrong, and his face turned a deep shade of pink. Mrs. Pritchett with her tightly wound bun and thin-framed glasses, as if she wanted to look the part of a strict school teacher. Danny clenched his fists at his sides, the memory of his chuckling classmates replaying in his mind, a never-ending loop. He inched past the window of the coach's darkened office. He could see the hallway up ahead. Almost there. Danny jumped back, surprised by his reflection in the dark office window. He quickly recognized his own shaggy brown hair and dark eyes staring back at him. He let out a short, nervous laugh. No one was around. He'd be outside soon, away from these assholes. There were only 2 people in Danny's life he considered friends. One of them sold weed. The other worked at the video game store down the street from his house. Danny socialized with them on a regular basis, but it was only out of necessity. The dealer let him buy whatever small amount of weed his allowance would provide for that week, and the game store clerk hooked him up with coupons and discounts. Sometimes they would shoot the shit for 10 or 15 minutes. But even those guys weren't close to Danny. Not really. He didn't have any real friends, and he liked it that way. At least, that's what he told himself. The truth was, his acne-covered face and long, dorky nose, combined with his quiet demeanor, made Danny easy prey for the hungry predators that walked the halls of his school. He rounded the corner of the hallway and hurried to the exit. He reached out, hesitantly, with his fingers above the push bar. He knew from experience there wasn't an alarm on this door, yet he always felt like there should be, like it was too easy. He held his breath and pushed it open anyway. He stepped into the sunlight and peered around. He didn't see anyone other than a woman up ahead, jogging, her back turned to Danny. Coast clear. He angled his face towards the sun and let it warm him. He closed his eyes and listened to the birds chirping, to the cars rolling down the street. Sweet freedom. He adjusted the book bag on his shoulders and headed for a nearby alley. It was one of his favorite spots, quiet and shady, between a vacant hardware store and a run-down Chinese restaurant. If he came home early and his parents were there, they would start asking questions. So Danny found ways to kill time. It was a short walk. He arrived at his private alley in less than a few minutes. The air was ripe with the smell of rotting Chinese food from the dumpster. But Danny didn't mind. It would help mask the odor of his smoke. He shrugged the backpack from his shoulders and leaned against the brick wall. He unzipped the front pocket, reached inside, and retrieved a small plastic bag. The smell of its leafy green contents caused the corner of his mouth to curl into a half smirk. He dug around in the canvas pocket again until he found his one hitter and lighter. Danny packed himself a hit. He held a flame to the end of it, took a pull, and let his head fall back against the dirty brick wall as his lungs absorbed the smoke. Mrs. Pritchett and the anger she caused him would be gone in 3, 2, 1. "You like to get high, do ya?" Danny jumped. He almost dropped the one-hitter. There appeared a tall man in a black fedora, leaning against the dumpster to his right. The hat matched his outfit, which was black from head to toe. He wore a vest beneath his fancy jacket, but no tie. Danny stuffed the paraphernalia into his back pocket, confusion wrinkling his brow. He was certain he'd been alone mere seconds ago. Now, said the man with a wave of his hand. "No need to hide what you've got. I'm cool with it, dude." The word dude sounded wrong coming from this man. Even standing in the shadow of the vacant warehouse, he looked old to Danny, ancient. Long white hair fell from beneath his fedora hat, in sharp contrast to his dark attire. "What do you want?" Danny eyed the man cautiously as he stepped into the sunlight, drawing near. His skin was so pale that Danny could see the veins in his hands, face, and neck, so dark beneath his alabaster flesh that they resembled cracks in a porcelain figure. Danny shivered. "I want to offer you a new kind of high." The man flashed a smile full of yellow teeth that were too sharp. Cat-like, thought Danny. The man inched closer and a stench filled the air. It overpowered the dumpster full of old Chinese food, as well as the pot smoke lingering in the breeze. The man was only a few feet away now. He stopped, holding Danny with a stare. Danny's nostrils flared. He tried not to show how the smell made his eyes water and his throat start to gag. It was awful, like the sulfuric smell of rotten eggs. "I'm not interested." Danny lifted his backpack from the ground. "And I don't have any money." He tried to move away from his unwelcome intruder, creeping sideways with his ass sliding against the wall, one hand gripping his book bag. "Oh, but I think you are." Again he smiled, with a mouth full of what seemed like monstrous fangs. It sent a tremor through Danny's limbs. The old man fixed Danny in a chilling stare. His eyes, which had appeared brown from a distance, now gleamed with a deep shade of red. "That low-grade garbage you're smoking is terrible for your lungs. It costs too much money, and the effects wear off too quickly. Am I right?" Danny nodded. "I've got something way better. A different kind of drug. It will take care of anything that's troubling you. Your problems will bother you no more. In fact, this stuff is so good, the first hit is free, because I know you'll come back for more." Danny gulped. "I don't mess around with the hard stuff, man. I'm not a junkie." The stranger chuckled. "No need to worry about that. This is a non-addictive experience, like acid or shrooms, only nobody ever has a bad trip." He stared at Danny and repeated the word ever. The man's eyes no longer held any traces of brown, instead shimmering a vibrant shade of crimson. "If I take this free sample, will you leave me alone?" Danny's voice was desperate, an octave too high. He wanted to run, but his legs were planted to the ground as if they had grown roots right through the cement. The man stepped closer, bringing a new wave of the sulfur-like stench with him. Danny felt sick to his stomach. The man reached into the breast pocket of his black dress suit. His spindly white fingers emerged, holding something dark and small between his withered fingertips. "Hold out your hand," he instructed. Danny did as he was told. A small, dark blob plopped against his palm. It resembled tar at first, but a wave ran through it that made the substance look a lot like black jello. Danny wasn't sure if it was supposed to be smoked or taken orally, but either way it didn't matter. He wasn't going to take it. "Now, let me explain how to take it," the man said, as if reading Danny's thoughts. He slid his hand beneath Danny's upturned palm. The stranger's skin was surprisingly hot, and he wanted to recoil, but didn't, partly because he was hoping his cooperation would end this encounter very soon, and partly because his body felt frozen in place. The man held a finger over the small, circular blob, and before Danny could attempt to pull away, he smashed the substance down, grinding it into his skin. Danny regained control of his body, fresh fear overriding whatever spell he'd been under. He pulled his arm away, screaming, "What the hell, man?" "That's how you take it," said the man through his rotten grin. Danny raised his hand just in time to see the dark substance disappearing into his pores. He felt it seeping into him. It was as cold as the stranger was hot. The man turned and walked away, and with his back turned to Danny, he uttered, "When you need me, you'll know where to find me." Danny didn't know how long it would take for the effects of the drug to kick in. He opted to hightail it home and hide in his room until he figured out exactly what he'd taken. His parents might be home and question his early arrival, but it was worth the risk. When he got there, sweaty and still a little panicked, Danny saw that neither car was parked out front. His parents were at work or maybe even driving home. Either way, the coast was clear for now. He breathed a sigh of relief and ran up the stairs, locking the door of his bedroom. He popped in a CD and attempted to drown out his thoughts. "Nobody ever has a bad trip. Your problems will bother you no more." The stranger's words echoed through his mind, but he didn't believe any of it. If anybody was going to have a bad trip, it was Danny Thornton. He had dubbed himself the king of shitty luck. Danny waited and waited, but he didn't have a bad trip. In fact, he didn't trip at all. After 3 hours of hiding in his bedroom, Danny decided that the stranger was nothing more than some old creep who got his jollies off of harassing young boys. He ate his microwave dinner, shoveling large spoonfuls into his mouth. He was tired, unusually tired for this hour. He went back up to his room, laid down on his bed, and soon Danny Thornton fell fast asleep. In his dreams, Danny stood in front of a house that looked familiar, but he didn't know why. It was a split-level home of moderate size. The second story was done in white siding, the bottom level in decorative brick. Black shutters framed the windows. Only one light was on, illuminating the upstairs window like a rectangular star against the dark, moonless night. A single tree stood in the yard. Its limbs were so twisted it appeared as though the branches grew in knots. The tree was the only interesting thing about the yard, with its freshly mowed grass and pruned shrubs lining the porch. Danny yawned. A thought occurred to him. Why am I yawning in a dream? Hey, how do I know that I'm dreaming? Unlike other dreams, which felt real until he woke up, Danny was somehow aware that he was asleep in his bed, that his mind was conjuring this entire thing up. He frowned. Of all the sexy scenarios his hormone-driven mind could have whipped up, of all the girls he pictured naked in the hallways of school, why was he standing in front of a plain-looking house on an average suburban street? He shrugged. There was only one way to find out. For some reason, his unconscious mind had brought him here, to this house. He didn't know how to wake himself up, so he might as well get on with it and do something. Crossed the lawn and started into the concrete patio. Danny tried the doorknob, but the door was locked. A strange voice filled his mind. "Try the back door," it suggested. He smelled the sulfur stench before he saw the man in black standing on the lawn, a fedora hat atop his long, thinning white hair. The man extended a spindly finger, pointing the way. He spoke in a hushed tone that somehow was crystal clear to Danny's ears. "She forgot to lock the back door." Danny stood on the porch, considering his options. Maybe the drug was finally taking effect on his brain. Maybe he was tripping in his dreams. This certainly didn't feel like any dream he'd ever had. It felt different, more like an alternate reality, one where Danny was aware of his dreaming. To make sure it was a dream, Danny concentrated all his thoughts on one idea, a two-headed squirrel. Soon enough, a furry little two-headed squirrel scampered across the grass. It stopped, its 4 beady eyes staring in different directions. It raised an acorn to both of its mouths, allowing each one a turn to nibble. Okay, now I know I'm dreaming, he thought. He looked up to where the ghastly man had been standing, but there was nothing there but an empty lawn. Danny was growing bored with this dream, or trip, whichever it was, and he was eager to get on with some action. Besides, what could possibly go wrong? This wasn't real. He headed around the side of the house, dropping down low when he came to a large window. He crawled past it and stood. Walking quickly, he stuck to the shadows and avoided the light of the street lamps. Even in this dream world, he knew that a nosy neighbor could easily spoil his mission. Of course, he had no idea what that mission actually was, but it didn't matter. Danny felt compelled to continue. The chorus of crickets serenaded him as he crept through the dark like a burglar. He came to the back door and tried the knob, a little shocked to discover that the creepy old man had been right. It was unlocked and swung soundlessly open. Beyond the door lay a dining room with hardwood floors and posh furniture. The room had a modern, stylish look, even in the darkness. His eyes had adjusted well enough to see clearly. Or maybe that was the drug heightening his senses. Danny couldn't stop thinking about the tar-like substance and how it had seeped into his pores. This dream felt so vivid, so real. He was certain he was tripping in his sleep. He tiptoed through the house. All was quiet, except for the white noise of the air conditioner and the heavy drumming of Danny's heart. Why am I here? He wondered. Artwork decorated the walls. Nothing special, just the generic stuff you could find at Kmart or Target. He passed a hanging mirror opposite the decorated wall, then stopped. He gasped and spun around to face the glass. Nothing was reflected in the mirror. That is, he was not reflected. The wall behind him was there, along with the ugly artwork. But no Danny. He lifted an arm and waved his hand, the way he'd seen countless movie characters do while confronting an empty mirror. Nothing changed. I'm invisible! Holy shit! I'm invisible! Adrenaline coursed through Danny's veins, bringing a newfound confidence. To think he had been sneaking through the yard so afraid of getting caught, and all along, he had this unknown special power. Yes, power. That's exactly what it was, because Danny felt very powerful indeed. I can do anything, he thought. Looking around the room, he noticed a framed photograph hanging a few feet from where he stood. He stepped closer. All at once, he knew why the house had looked so familiar. A middle-aged couple smiled at him from the photo. They stood in front of the house with its white siding on the top, brick on the lower level, and black shutters flanking the windows. The tree with twisted branches stuck out of the ground just behind them. It was a young, wispy tree in the picture. He knew this photo. It was the same one Mrs. Pritchett kept on her desk. Danny had glanced over at it many times as he was forced to stand in front of the class for some form of humiliation or another. It was hard not to notice the large 8x10 picture towering over everything else on her desk. In the photo, Mrs. Pritchett and her late husband beamed. He held her close, his muscular hand wrapped around her waist. Danny suspected that her husband's sudden passing was the reason why Mrs. Pritchett was such a bitch. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was how she made him feel, and she inspired him with only one feeling. A cold hatred that burned through his veins as if his blood had been spiked with dry ice. Just think of what she's done to you, the voice whispered in his head. Danny glanced around the room, expecting to see the man in black standing there, thin white hair and alabaster skin glowing in the shadows. But no one was there, only the voice in his head saying, "She let them all laugh at you." Danny's hands trembled with rage. He balled them into fists. His adrenaline surged. An intense fury blossomed in the core of his being, growing larger by the second, filling him with such hatred until only one thought remained: revenge. Danny approached the French door near the dining room table. He peered through. The kitchen lay just ahead. He hurried to the counter and opened a drawer. Nothing but dish towels and sponges. He slammed it shut, then opened another, slam, then another, slam. He found pencils, no. Scissors, maybe. Silverware, definitely not. He needed something sharp, something with a good grip, because his hands were shaking faster than a trading card on the spokes of a bicycle wheel. Otherwise, he felt good. Somehow confident, ready to release the pent-up emotion that rattled him from spine to fingers. He continued rifling through the kitchen. After half a dozen drawers were slammed, a shaky voice called from the other room. "Hello? Who's there? I'm on the phone with 911, so whoever you are, you better leave." Shit. Danny hadn't considered that being invisible didn't mean Mrs. Pritchett couldn't hear him. He'd been making a racket in the kitchen, alerting her to his presence. Now he wouldn't be able to sneak up on her in bed like he'd been hoping to do. He stopped moving for a moment. He stood very still, biting his lip. And that's when he saw a wooden block sitting atop the island counter, the handles of a dozen knives jutting out from its surface, calling his name. Danny, Danny, come play with us. So he did. He selected the largest one, squeezing it so tight that all traces of blood left his knuckles. He bolted through the French door and scanned the area. A doorway across the room led to a small foyer. He hurried to it and glanced to his left, where a staircase led to the second floor. A panicked Mrs. Pritchett sat halfway up the stairs with the phone pressed against her worried face. She locked eyes with the knife, but not with Danny. No, she couldn't see Danny at all. A maniacal laugh erupted from his throat, and for a moment he wondered, could she hear his laughter? Could she hear him taunting her? He hoped so. Oh my God, she breathed, no doubt wondering why a butcher knife from her kitchen was floating in the air, angled and shaking as if it were held by an invisible madman. And it was. Danny grinned. He charged up the stairs. The woman shrieked and was almost to her feet when he jumped her. The side of her face hit the corner of the stair. There was a crunching noise as the bones in her cranium fractured. Danny liked it. He wondered what other noises she might make when the real punishment began. He raised the knife and brought it down into her back, purposefully avoiding the spine. He wanted her to feel this, all of it. She screamed and wheezed as the blade punctured her lung. He smiled and yanked the knife from her back. Danny brought it down again, plunging deep into the muscles just below her shoulder. She shrieked and pleaded as she bucked wildly, like a bull at the rodeo. She managed to thrust her elbow backward and connect with Danny's chin. It hurt a lot, but the pain gave him a second wind. He wanted to see her face. He wanted to watch the light fade from her eyes. He couldn't flip her over with a butcher knife clutched in his hand, so he dropped it. Why did he need it anyway? The bitch couldn't even see him. He grabbed her roughly by the arm and turned her over. She was crying. Her glasses sat crookedly on her face. They were bent into an odd position on the side of her head that had slammed the stairs. A greenish bruise was already forming there. Her eyes pleaded with the empty air, looking not at Danny but past him. Nothing new. Things had always been this way between them. She never really saw Danny Thornton. No, she merely gazed through him as if he were a nobody. He wrapped his hands around her throat and squeezed as tight as he could manage. Her eyes grew wide behind her broken glasses. She tried to jerk her head from side to side, but managed a barely noticeable shake. Her arms flailed as she threw punches at random, unable to see her attacker and too frenzied to aim, even if she could. She made no sound at all. She couldn't. Her windpipe was pinched by Danny's thumbs. The blows softened as her arms lost muscle power. Her eyes stared blankly. She was barely fighting at all now. An eerie shade of lavender had washed over her face. Her lips were deathly pale, trying to form some semblance of her final words. Mrs. Pritchett and the anger she caused Danny to feel would be gone in 3, 2, 1. Danny woke up and stretched. He couldn't remember what he had dreamed about last night, but he knew it had been good because he felt good. In fact, he felt like he'd been asleep for days and had awakened to a brand new life. He knew that wasn't the case. For one, it was impossible, and secondly, his cell phone told him the time and date. He'd been asleep for 9 hours. Still, he felt somehow different this morning. Better. The sun was shining and Danny had time to spare, so he decided to walk to school. He didn't want to snap out of his good mood. The jerks on the bus would make sure that he did. They would see him smiling or walking with a bounce in his step, and they'd take that good mood away from him, simply because they could. Danny didn't head straight to the school. He decided to savor this rare feeling of happiness before it was inevitably crushed. He walked with no particular direction in mind, unconsciously letting his legs lead the way. He passed a flower garden, a small dog yapping behind a wooden fence, a little girl riding a pink tricycle. In the distance, a lawnmower grunted and came to life. Danny took it all in as he walked, on and on, simply enjoying himself. He turned down whichever street appealed to him most, thinking, so what if I'm late for school? He came upon a house with white siding on the top, brick deco walls on the bottom, and black shutters framing the windows. A police car sat empty at the end of the driveway, another one parked at the curb. The cement porch was lined with yellow plastic strips that read "Crime Scene" in bold black font. Figure in blue passed the open threshold of the house. Danny's blood ran cold. A slideshow of violent images flashed through his mind as he stared blankly at the yellow tape dancing in the wind. He saw the knife plunge into Mrs. Pritchett's back, blood shining on the blade as he removed it. He saw it slice into her shoulder, saw her flesh rip open, her clothes become sticky and red. He saw his hands around her neck, the woman's eyes pleading behind broken glasses. The lifeless, glassy eyes looking through him. But it had all been a dream, right? Just a dream. Danny smiled. It was a dream. He was certain of that. But it was also something more. Those things he had done, they had really happened somehow. Danny turned and headed back. He knew now why his feet had carried him here. His senses were heightened. Foreign chemicals still lingered in the tissue of his brain, the vestiges of a strange black substance. As he quickened his pace, taking the streets that would lead him to school, he thought maybe, just maybe, his good mood might last. Danny arrived at school 1 hour late. He got a tardy pass from the office and made his way to his locker. The halls were abuzz with gossip. The news of Mrs. Pritchett's death was being whispered from ear to ear. A few students even talked right out loud. Stabbed and choked, he overheard them say. His ego grew a little larger as he realized everyone was talking about the murder. Students gathered around the drinking fountain or trading one book for another at their locker, pondering the gruesome crime scene, wondering how gory it had been. Some were sad, some indifferent, and some actually looked relieved. Danny guessed that the recently widowed Mrs. Pritchett had been hard on more students than just him. He was filled with a smug satisfaction as he spun the combination on his locker and yanked it open. He had done that. Danny Thornton. He had killed mean Mrs. Pritchett and silenced her bitchy tongue forever. His ego swelled, and Danny decided to try the impossible today. He decided to talk to a girl. He spotted Lisa Hargraves coming down the hall. She wasn't the prettiest girl in school, but even Danny's burgeoning self-esteem didn't trick him into thinking he stood a chance with the popular girls. Lisa was somewhere in between, and even better, she was alone. It was easier to approach girls when they were outside of their herd. Not that Danny had ever tried before. He closed his locker and swooped in beside the girl. "Hey, Lisa," he said. She had light blue eyes, brown hair, and a plain face with lots of freckles, but she was cute enough that Danny had caught himself looking at her a few times. "Can I walk you to class?" Lisa stopped and turned to him, crinkling her nose in disgust. She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, right, Danny, in your dreams." She started to walk again, but Danny stayed behind. Blood rushed to his face and neck, and he knew he was turning pink. But he didn't care. All he cared about was the sudden ache in his chest. Lisa's words had pierced right through his heart. Her rejection of him hurt more than any bully in the past. It stung so badly, he could only think of one response. "You know what?" he said. "That's a deal, Lisa. I'll see you in my dreams." Danny laughed. A few classmates shot him a scrutinizing sneer. The warning bell rang, shattering the silence that had formed all around him. Everyone had seen Lisa take him down a peg and heard his crazy reply. Fuck them, he thought. Fuck them all. Danny Thornton hated everyone in his school. He would see them in his dreams tonight and the next night, just as soon as he found the man in black. "When you need me, you'll know where to find me," he had said. And Danny did know where to find him, and he wanted more of that strange black substance, no matter what the cost.